As we talked about last week, membership is about partnership. And it's partnering to join the mission of God. You as a disciple of Jesus, if you are a disciple of Jesus, then there's a high calling. And part of that calling is to follow Jesus, to be changed by Jesus, to be transformed, to live a life according to his ways and his teachings and his value system, and then ultimately to step into his mission. And I would say Northeast expects that of all of our members, but it's not Northeast. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And we want to set up the way we do church and the way we embody that calling as the church. We want to set ourselves up in a way that lends itself for all of us to step into his mission. And so when someone places membership, we are partnering together. It is joining forces to go out and to be a part of what God is doing in the world, to lift one another up and to encourage each other. We're here to lean on each other in good times and in bad times. And in life, if there's one thing that's guaranteed, is that we're going to have some bad times occasionally. There's going to be struggles. There's going to be challenges that we face. But that's not unique to you and me. That's been true for all of human history. And as was mentioned in our scripture reading this morning, we look at a text this morning where Paul, who's an early church leader and church planter and wrote many letters, he writes this letter to the Philippians, and while doing so, most likely he is in a Roman prison. It could have been other places, but we think most likely a Roman prison. And you think about the struggles that we have, the challenges we have, and they're real. And for Paul, they were real as well, as he finds himself behind bars for doing what was right, for spreading the message of the gospel, not for being an enemy of the world. In his mind, yet they considered him an enemy, and he was imprisoned because of it. And so this morning, we're going to look together at this text, and Paul brings us into some insight of how he's able to continue to have joy despite the fact that he's behind bars. And if you're joining him for the first time this morning, you'll see in your pews, there's a little handout there for you. And for this fall series that we're doing on Philippians, our life group or small group ministry is following along these sermons. And these are for our life groups, but this is for anybody who wants to take notes for that. But for those who are in our life group ministry, there for you to be able to participate and write down notes and be able to take that into your group and remember what that preacher said. So, and what we talked about in the text today. So, as we look at this text today, Paul starts off. And this is amazing. And this is going to really be sort of the heart of our lesson here, and really the heart of this text. He says now, as he's writing to this church in Philippi, who's anxiously waiting to hear back from him. They sent a messenger up to him to be able to meet his needs. And he says, now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not my first move when I'm going through a struggle. It's not the first move. I get frustrated talking to the robot operator, the AI operator on the other side when you're trying to call, someone on your appliance or whatever. You get frustrated. Why is this happening? The smallest things. But I know the people in this room, and I know some of you are dealing with some real stuff. And I have as well in my life, as we all have. And for Paul, his move is to say, I want you to know that what's happened to me, and he's behind bars unjustly. It's not like he deserved to be there. He was doing what is right. If he was in, a church setting, he would be praised. You're doing wonderful. If he was a kid in Sunday school, he'd have all the stars, right? He should be rewarded for what he's doing, but instead he finds himself behind bars, right? He should have been getting an award for best citizen as he travels through these different towns, or because of the good that he was doing each time he planted a church and made a difference in these communities. Yet he finds himself behind bars. And I don't know about you, but I hate being misunderstood, or I hate being, when someone's mad at me when I think I've done what's right. Do you hate that? There's probably nothing worse than that, is when you get in trouble or you face opposition because you were doing the right thing. We feel something there. And there's this, I was doing the right thing. I was doing what I was supposed to do. Why am I facing these struggles? And so my first move would probably be to call a lawyer or to try to figure out the next steps. And not that those things would be bad, but I would have an attitude of like, I'm not supposed to be here. This isn't right. And you know what? It wasn't right for Paul to be imprisoned in these moments. Yet he's able to have this attitude where he's able to put on a different set of lenses and say, actually, church, what has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. And there's two ways that Paul says that the gospel has been advanced through his imprisonment. First one is this. He says, as a result, it has become clear through the whole palace guard. Again, this would have been in any Greek city, but maybe an indication he was imprisoned in Rome. He said that it's been made clear to the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Now, what Paul is saying here is not that, therefore, now all the palace guard are followers of Jesus, they're now Christians. That's not necessarily the case, although in other places there might be some indications that he did reach some of those people. However, the point here is that it's made clear to even the Gentiles around them, the non-Jewish people. Paul himself was a Jew, and it was the seedbed for Christianity in which Jesus made disciples. And for the Gentiles, who were non-Jews, who were the people of the Greco-Roman world, people like me, and probably a lot of people in this room, who didn't have a background reading the Bible, reading the Old Testament scriptures, Paul says it's been made evident to them that actually this man's in prison for doing something right, not doing something wrong. Now, they probably didn't accept that everything that Christ was doing and what Christ had done was all good. It was probably neutral to them, but nevertheless, they understood this man, Paul, had not committed a crime, but he was here preaching on the behalf of this so-called Christ. But no doubt inspired some to ask questions. You can see in other places, like in Colossians and others, where Paul asks for prayers to be able to represent Christ well in these type of scenarios and these opportunities. And so that's the first way that Paul says that the gospel has been advanced through his imprisonment. And the second thing is, because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. In other words, the church was inspired. And this caused them to be set fire and to be excited and to be ready and confident. They weren't happy Paul was in prison, but inspired to see the boldness of his faith, that he was in prison, that he was willing to be in prison on behalf of Christ. That inspired the church all over to become more bold. Because the reason Paul's arrested and the reason why the city officials and all the places he would try to step in is that they're hoping to take away some of that boldness, is to quiet and to get him to stop proclaiming. But as often happens when someone is persecuted or a group is persecuted, actually it tends to embolden. And that's the case here, is that instead of causing the church to cower in fear, it actually inspires them in boldness to proclaim the gospel without fear. And so what we draw from this is that God uses broken circumstances to advance the gospel. You see, Paul doesn't take credit for any of this and say, look what I've done, but he's able to take those lenses, similar to the story of Joseph in Genesis 50, where all this has happened to Joseph. He had lost family. He was a man of God in the book of Genesis who seemingly was, betrayed by his family, but seemingly was left for dead. Yet he was in jail and in prison, but then God raises him up. He becomes a leader in Egypt, is able to actually then provide salvation for all the region and his family. And he looks at that and says, what was meant for evil, God has used for good. And that's true for Paul. And I think that's what Paul's emphasizing here. What Paul is not saying is that actually it was a good thing for me to be imprisoned. And actually God planned it this way. God inflicted me with this imprisonment. That's not what Paul says here. But instead, what Paul recognizes is that God is able to take broken circumstances. This is not the way things should be. Good people should not be imprisoned because people don't like the message. That's not a good thing. But God used broken circumstances to advance the gospel. And for us, no doubt, as human beings, as many people in this room, there's some of us this morning who probably have some broken circumstances. And we're left wondering sometimes, what does this mean? What are we supposed to do now that something has happened that just shouldn't be? And we ask all types of questions. I know for me, I ask, why is this happening? Why is this scenario broken? Why are others treating me this way? Why did I act in a certain way? Or we might even ask the question, what's wrong with me that would cause these circumstances to happen? I know if I was Paul, I'd probably be thinking, did I preach a little too hard? Was I a little unkind in my message that got me here? Should I not have been pushing when I should have just been encouraging? I know I'd be second guessing at times. Why has this happened? But the truth is, sometimes things just happen because they're broken, and they're not supposed to be that way. And it's not God causing it. Not that God never works through those scenarios, as we're saying He does. And in Scripture, I'm not even saying that God has never worked a situation that was unfavorable. But in most cases, it's not God who has caused them. But what we see is that God is able to use those circumstances to advance the gospel. And for you and I, our job in that is learning to recognize that. And so instead of just asking, of course we're going to ask this question when we're treated unjustly, but we need to move to this question, is how might God use this to advance the gospel? How might God use this to advance the gospel? Maybe we're in a situation like Paul, where, okay, I didn't know I was going to be in these circumstances, but now I'm here. What good can be done to those who now I'm around because I'm in these circumstances? For him, of course, it was that he was in prison. And so now there's these people around him who he has an opportunity to talk to that he wouldn't normally have to talk to. So Paul then steps in to advance the gospel. It could be, like in the second scenario, could be sharing your story. And that's able to encourage others around you. Because, okay, I've gone through this struggle. I've gone through this health crisis. I've gone through this financial crisis. I've gone through a crisis in my family. Okay, this is not good. I'm not happy that this happened. I don't think God caused this. But now, here's the reality. It's broken. We're in this situation. How might God use this to advance the gospel? What hard conversations need to happen? What good conversations need to happen? Who do you now have the opportunity to talk to that you maybe didn't have before? Or now that you've gone through a trial, now that you've gone through a struggle, who might be willing to listen to you who wouldn't have been willing to listen to you before, because now you have credibility. You've gone through this struggle. How might God use this to advance the gospel? And as we said, how can my story inspire others? And that highlights this fact. And I don't want you to walk away today that, okay, Noah talked about what it means to go through suffering and how I individually can live this out, because this is bigger than just me. This is bigger than us as individuals. There's certainly an application for you individually for how to suffer well and how to go through trials well. That's important. But here's the important thing, is that this is all about partnership. That if you are a disciple of Jesus, you're partnered with God, but you're also partnered with the other people you see in this room, other disciples of Jesus. Paul, although he sat in this cell alone, he was not alone. He had a church partnered with him, rooting him on each step of the way, sending resources to him, helping him, sending a messenger to encourage him, as we're going to see later on in the book in weeks to come. Paul had the church with him. And this didn't happen in a silo, but instead it spread out. As Paul suffered for the sake of the gospel, it infected, in a good way, all of the church. And they were emboldened and inspired to live out their faith. It says, because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. I know there was a time when I was in the first church I was working with as an associate minister, and I was trying to get creative. What is some type of way for us to reach the community? There weren't a lot of people coming and visiting us on a Sunday, especially from the community. So what is a way we can connect? And so I don't know where I got this. I had moved a lot after college and to an apartment, and there's a better deal, moved a lot. And so I'd been using Craigslist some, and then that was kind of more popular before Facebook Marketplace came really popular. So I was buying, didn't have a lot of money and right out of college, and so I was trying to get some good deals and all that stuff. So I was using Craigslist. And so I got kind of accustomed to it. I kind of understood how the platform worked at that time. It's not what it used to be. And so I got this crazy idea. I don't know where it came from. I think it probably came from the Lord. But I decided to put on Craigslist free Bible study. Oh man, this is going to be weird. And so I really didn't think, at first I thought it was going to get something back, but then I thought, this is too crazy and no one's going to answer back to a free Bible study on Craigslist. And I had a little description. I had this Bible study I'd put together, and so I advertised all that. Well, randomly, I get a text, and sure enough, someone wants to have a Bible study. But then I panicked. I said, I didn't think anyone was actually going to do it. I got to meet some random person on Craigslist to have a Bible study. And so I invited one of the other young adults at our church to join along with me, and we began to study with this man. And he had some friends, and they started coming too, and it kind of grew. And there's probably at one point 5 to 10 different ranging of different people who'd meet at a local Starbucks and study through this. And everything seemed to be going good. We're on the same page on a lot of things, but I could kind of foresee, there were some disagreements coming. And so we, probably 6 months into this of weekly or bi-weekly, I don't remember, meeting together, we had chili over at their apartment, and built a relationship, felt safe with them, and they had us in their home, and we had, a chili night. All that was great, and almost felt like we had a life group, a little small group that we had formed from Craigslist. And everything was going good, and I won't get into all the details of it, but one night, as we studied something, or the week before, we had studied something that they did not agree with, and they didn't seem to voice that the week before. And this was a pretty crucial thing. And when we came back the next week, I could tell something had shifted. The week before, we're eating chili, and there's warmth, there's kindness, and it was just a blessing to get together. And then the next week, something had shifted. They had talked to somebody, and someone had shifted their mindset, and they convinced them that we were like these false teachers. We were these like terrible people. Literally ends up, through the conversation, they're telling us, all that they're angry with us about. They actually said, I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at Satan. Oh, have you ever had someone, that was like literally a get behind me Satan moment, except it wasn't Jesus. And like, that kind of hurt. It was like, wow. And they kicked us out of the apartment. And again, it was a theological conversation. I think it was something we could have talked through, but they didn't give us the chance. They apparently talked to someone, and they warned, said, well, if they believe this and they believe, X, Y, and Z, and there was no reasoning. It was just, I thought we were. I still, to this day, I look back, I think we were kind. We tried to stay quiet. We tried to understand, but we were kicked out of the apartment, and so we left. I remember driving back to to his house to drop him off, my partner, and it was just silent all the way there. We were just so sad. Like, how did this happen? Why couldn't we have had a civil discussion about this? But we were left dejected. And then later on, I was actually asked to write about that experience in there's a paper in Churches of Christ. It's no longer as circulated anymore, but it's the Gospel Advocate. And I wrote an article in there. And I kind of told that story. I left the whole getting kicked out of the apartment thing, all of that out. But I talked about this Craigslist Bible study. And in fact, as I look back at that might have even happened in that process before we were kicked out. But I had wrote about that. And so later on, I received an email from, again, a random person in South Dakota or something, I don't know, who had read that article. And he had decided he's going to try this out. And so he began to do these Craigslist Bible studies, and he would put it out, free Bible study. I don't know if he still does this today or not, but at the time, he had not just one Bible study, but he had several different Bible studies. And I think a couple different people joined in from his church and started doing that as well. And what that showed me is, although it didn't work out for me, and we kicked out left, but I was able to share that story, and there's nothing on me. I mean, in a sense, I feel like I failed. Like we didn't do it right. Yet God was able to do something in that. And just sharing a simple story about Craigslist Bible studies inspired someone in a totally different state. And that ended up multiplying in a way that I could have never foreseen and inspired someone to step into it. And so I don't share that to say, hey, look at something I did, because again, it didn't go so well for me, but to encourage you. What is your story? And how can you inspire the other people you see in this room? How can we encourage each other? Be transparent. Be vulnerable. Even those things hurt. Paul, it was probably embarrassing somewhat to say, yeah, I wasn't able to be diplomatic enough. I couldn't say the right things, but I ended up in prison. Paul, this great preacher, he couldn't talk his way out of this. It's probably something, it feels, it shouldn't be that way, but maybe we feel something. But instead, we, as Paul does, be vulnerable. Share. Even in our cases, even when we fail, be able to share that, because we don't know who we can inspire to step into God's mission and how God can advance the gospel through that. But then the second main thought here, I want to move forward, is the second thing that came out of this is, okay, so the brothers and sisters get inspired. They become more confident to proclaim the gospel without fear. And again, there's two results from this. On the one hand, there were some who were emboldened to preach the gospel, but apparently they were doing it for the wrong reasons. It says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. And so there's these two different options of these people who are emboldened to go proclaim the gospel and start sharing the gospel with their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers. But some were doing it out of envy and rivalry, and some were doing out of goodwill. And when you first read that first scripture, you think, okay, people are emboldened to preach the gospel. This is wonderful. This is great. But then the enemy is able to influence them and give them bad motives. And what we want is this. It says, the latter, they do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Right? That's what we hope. When we inspire others, we want them to do it out of goodwill and love, and they're out there doing it for the right reason. And I know for any of you who have discipled someone or come alongside someone and mentored them and built them up, right? You want to see them thriving. You want to see them living genuinely in the Lord. And we long for those cases, and we want that's our intended result when we invest and build into others and try to inspire others. And in many cases, this is the outcome. And that's how the church multiplies. And that's how we continue to make more and more disciples of Jesus. But then it says, but the former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. And so the theory is that there were those who were emboldened because they knew that Paul was in prison. And they actually look at this as an opportunity. Okay, he's in prison. We can make a name for ourselves now. There's so many people who were following Paul as a way of following Jesus. And I mean that in the best kind of way. As Paul says, imitate me, is that they looked at Paul. They recognized his God-given leadership. And then there were others who say, okay, Paul's out of the way now. I can push my own agenda. I can make a name. It says, apparently, Paul says that they were doing this for this selfish ambition, or it's out of envy or greed. This was an opportunity for them to make a name for themselves and to push their agenda forward. And so they do it not sincerely. And if you're like me, maybe you're kind of an all or nothing thinker. And I'm like, well, what they're doing has no meaning. This is a catastrophe. We've got hypocrites out there now proclaiming the gospel in Paul's absence. And this is terrible. We know that their motives are wrong. We know that they're in it for the wrong reasons. They're in it for money. They're in it for influence. They're in it for power. And if we're honest with ourselves, we realize that maybe that scenario isn't so rare. And maybe you know of some people like that. And maybe you know of some churches that have been infected from that type of leadership. But Paul responds to a different way. And before I get there, I just want to say this. As we talk about the idea of partnership, And again, I know our series is With Joy. This series is really a lot more about partnership than it is about joy. With Joy, which is the title of the series, is the idea is that you and I are partnered. Well, how are we partnered? And how are we to move together? And that's what this with joy. Why? Because our lives are rooted in Christ. And you and I share in the Holy Spirit together. And that for the common purpose of the mission of God. And for that reason, we ought to rejoice. But I want to point this out. Partnership is messy. Partnership is messy. In fact, sometimes we find ourselves in the bad situation because of our partnerships. Is that not true? Sometimes we find ourselves in the messy situation. Sometimes we find ourselves hurt, not because of those who are outside of Christ, but sometimes it's because of those who are in Christ, those who are supposed to be our fellow brothers and sisters. Partnership is messy. And if you really want to be honest with yourself this morning, we realize that sometimes it's not because a situation might be messy not just because of what someone else has done, but something we have done. And we've caused the mess. Partnership is messy. When we work with people, it's messy. Teamwork is messy. Working together is messy. Probably some of you, if I had to guess, I was sometimes like this, but then I learned to just kind of go with the flow and benefit from it. But anytime in school, you'd get like the group project type thing. I used to dread that, And there's some of you who think it'd just be so much easier if I could just do it myself. Right? It's going to be much more productive. There's going to be a few stragglers. I was occasionally that straggler in middle school who would, lean on that one person who's going to get it done. And my wife's that person. So it's like those two people find themselves and marry each other. But you're that person who I'd rather do it myself. And everyone else is just going to try to mooch off of what I'm doing and not contribute. Because teamwork is messy. In a school project sense, okay, we can get past that. We can get the project done, get the grade. But in church, we can't move past that. We can't avoid community and partnership because it's messy. And so instead, what we see Paul do here is actually step into that and say, well, what can God do in the midst of these broken circumstances and these messy situations? And what new thing can he create? Because that's what God does. He creates new things. He resurrects. He brings new life. So here's what Paul says. Right? For you and I think we look at those people who are preaching the gospel out of envy or out of greed for selfish reasons. We'd say, well, all of their work, it's useless. Why even preach Christ if you're going to do it out of envy? What are you thinking to accomplish? And Paul would agree that that's wrong. That's not right. But he says, ultimately, listen, what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And he says, and because of that, I rejoice. Now, Paul does not justify the wrong motives. He does not justify bad motives. But what he's saying is, listen, leave that up to God. God's going to handle that. It's all going to come out in the wash. But instead, we should recognize and rejoice that Christ is preached. And rejoice at that. Even when we see brothers and sisters we don't agree with, we don't align perfectly with, we think, man, they're out there doing so much harm because of this or that, or we don't agree on this issue, or we think they're really about the numbers, or they're really about the money. No, rejoice. Rejoice because Christ is preached. And that's a lesson for me to learn. But we understand this, that God uses broken, not just circumstances, that was our first point, but God uses broken people to advance the gospel. The truth is, at any given moment in our life, that all of us as disciples of Jesus at some point probably have the wrong motives. And we probably have bad motives at times. We're not all pure. We're not always what we should be. So God uses people like you and me who are broken, and people in our city, other churches that maybe we don't align with on everything, or around the world, or people in other churches in different states or cities maybe you've been a part of and you've left and you think, man, things are not right, the leadership's not right, things could be better. But understand this, is that if God can use broken circumstances to advance the gospel, God uses broken people to advance the gospel too. And the hardest part of that to accept, but also the most freeing, is that includes you and me as well. And because of this, I rejoice that God is able to take broken circumstances, broken people, and even messy partnerships, which are bound to happen in our lifetime and in our churches. Yet he's able to use those to continue to advance the gospel. And so the important thing for us to do is when we face those circumstances, we face those messy partnerships, not step away from them, not cut off from them, but instead lean in, proceed in the love of Christ. Yes, have hard conversations. Don't allow things to be swept under the rug, but proceed with joy. And so this morning, just 2 thoughts of application for you. Number 1, if you're going through a trial this morning, take that, yes, absolutely, this applies to you as an individual. Understand that God is with you. He's not doing this to punish you, but instead, he's able to put on those new lens and be able to see that God's able to work these things out for good, even though the situation is not good. And he's able to use it and use you to advance the gospel. And then the second thing is, how are we to reach the world for the mission of God? How are we to proceed in a broken world with just covered and immersed in broken circumstances? And the answer is together, in the mess of it all, with joy. And so we as a church are committed to be a church of partners and the disciples of Jesus who are joined together for the common work of advancing the gospel. And that's a work that we join in, but ultimately God accomplishes. And we just get to sit back, enjoy, be a part, yes, but understand it's God working through us. And so this morning, whatever your need might be, maybe you're going through one of those difficult circumstances, I encourage you this week, lean into God. But also lean into your brothers and sisters. If you're going through a trial and maybe you've been thinking, I can do this alone. I've done it before. I can pick myself up on my bootstraps and I can endure it. You can do that. That's a choice. You can do that. But I encourage you and want to tell you, you don't have to do that. And really, you should join in, share that with a brother or sister here at Northeast, your partners in the gospel, in order for God to work in your life, to work in their life, and for the gospel to be advanced. Whatever your need might be, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.